Hello, our esteemed panelists, colleagues, counter-trafficking advocates, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the 15th ASEAN-Australia Counter-Trafficking or ASEAN-ACT webinar series on adoptive justice responses in trafficking in persons. I am Darlene Pajarito, Justice Systems Director of ASEAN-ACT, dialing in from the Philippines, and it is my pleasure to host this webinar with my colleague Chanapat Manidu joining me from Thailand. The presence of many participants today always makes this webinar more exciting, especially now that we have more than 500 registrants. So thank you. Your presence is greatly appreciated. So with the UN International Women's Day being observed on the 8th of March, this webinar on forced marriage dimensions of human trafficking is essential as it would bring to the forefront much needed conversation about the phenomenon of forced marriage where victims are mostly women and young girls. Before we proceed, here are the house rules.
Hello, thank you for joining us today. We would like to make this virtual event a pleasing and productive experience. To make this happen, the organizers request all participants to observe the following house rules. You may use the chat box when you want to provide inputs or comments. For documentation purposes, this event will be recorded. If you require special assistance to take part in this event, please notify our event organizers so that we can accommodate to your needs. Please click on the interpretation button at the bottom of your screen to select the language of your choice. Our interpreters are on standby. Lastly, as we are in a virtual environment, we will be kind to one another in case of internet connection issues. We will expect unavoidable technical difficulties. Feel free to join back if you're disconnected. Everyone's patience will be greatly appreciated. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you. So for our speakers today, except for Mr. Sebastian Bol, who will be presenting in English, our Vietnamese and Myanmar speakers will be presenting in their respective languages. So to listen to this webinar in the language you prefer, there is an interpretation icon at the lower right portion of your screen. Please click on that and choose either English, Lao, Bahasa Indonesia, Burmese, Thai, and Vietnamese to listen if that is your preferred language. Now, if you want to listen in Khmer, please click on the Spanish channel for interpretation. And also please mute the original audio. All right, so today, to open and welcome you to our webinar, we are honored to have Ms. Carla Uranek, First Secretary, Australian Mission to ASEAN. The virtual floor is yours, First Secretary Carla.
Thank you, Darlene, and good afternoon, counter-trafficking partners, practitioners, advocates, and other distinguished colleagues from around the ASEAN region and beyond. Welcome to the first ASEAN-Australia Counter-Trafficking Program webinar for 2023. This month marks International Women's Day, an important time to celebrate the achievements of women and girls worldwide and acknowledge the persistent challenges that inhibit gender equality and the full realisation of the rights of women and girls. Today's webinar, The Forced Marriage Dimension of Human Trafficking, highlights the particular vulnerability of women and girls to human trafficking and the differences between men and women, boys and girls when it comes to marriage and freedom of choice. According to the global estimates of modern slavery on forced labour and forced marriage, released in 2022, approximately 22 million people were living in forced marriage situations in 2021. Of this total number, almost 15 million were women and girls. The drivers of trafficking for forced marriage in Southeast Asia are complex and multifaceted. They include poverty and economic hardship, conflict and unrest, socio-cultural and religious factors, and lack of access to education and empowerment opportunities for women and girls. Despite the adoption of a resolution by the UN Human Rights Council in 2015 to recognise child and forced marriage as human rights violations, investigation and prosecution of trafficking for the purpose of marriage remains disproportionately low. One of the most notable reasons is the lack of international legal definition of forced marriage. And in addition, there is also limited literature on the intersection between forced marriage and trafficking in persons. This webinar seeks to explore the nexus between forced marriage and human trafficking and provide insights on the heightened vulnerabilities of women and girls in Southeast Asia to trafficking for forced marriage. Today's discussion also provides an opportunity to highlight counter-trafficking measures with a particular focus on preventing and responding to trafficking to forced marriage, including transnational responses that address the drivers of this crime, as well as those that safeguard the rights of women and girls and promote their access to justice. Today, we are honoured to welcome a great panel of experts. Mr. Sebastian Boll, Regional Migration and Displacement Specialist, United Nations Development Programme. Ms. Nguyen Thuy Hin, Vice Director, Centre for Women and Development, Vietnam Women's Union. Mr. So Ta Shi, Project Manager, Yangon Cayenne Baptist Women's Association. We are very pleased to have a panel of experts who will offer their perspectives on the push and pull factors underpinning trafficking for forced marriage and share best practices on prevention and effective responses to this crime, which has particularly detrimental impacts on women and girls. With the expertise of the panel and the collective knowledge in the virtual room, I'm confident this webinar will generate valuable learnings on the importance of continuing to advance women's empowerment and gender equality as an important counter-trafficking measure. Australia's commitment to supporting partners in the region to achieve this is outlined in the Australian Government's Second National Action Plan on Women, Peace and Security. The plan reflects Australia's commitment to working with our international partners in advancing gender equality and the rights of women and girls in our region and through broader international engagement to prevent crimes, particularly those with gendered causes and consequences, including human trafficking and forced marriage. ASEAN-ACT, or the Australia Counter-Trafficking Program, as our flagship program to combating trafficking in persons, is an important initiative for realising this commitment. On behalf of the Australian Government, thank you for your strong interest and participation to discuss this very important issue of forced marriage impacting women and girls in this region. I wish this webinar a great success. Thank you, Darlene.
Thank you very much, First Secretary Carla Yernek, for your encouraging remarks and highlighting women's empowerment and gender equality as an important counter-trafficking measures, especially in the light of this underexplored phenomenon of forced marriage. Now, let us take a group photo with our distinguished guests. So please turn on your cameras. Our team will take the screenshot, 2 shots actually. Vicky, just let us know if it's ready.
Yes. 3, 1, 2, 3. One more time with the waves, please. One with the waves. Thank you so much. 1, 2, 3. Sorry, another shot, please. 1, 2, 3. Thank you so much.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Vicky. And thank you everyone for the big smiles. All right. So ASEAN-ACT is in its 3rd year in organizing and hosting webinars, and we are always grateful for the feedback and to help us continually improve. So I would like to share with you the feedback from our last webinar held on December 3 on the topic, disability is not a barrier, discrimination is, promoting the rights of persons with disabilities in combating human trafficking. So as you see on the slides, it states there that 95% of the participants responded that the topic was relevant to their work and the speakers were knowledgeable. At the time, our speakers were included an Indonesian judge and NGO workers from Vietnam and Thailand championing the rights of persons with disability. So as you can see, 95% also said that they learned something new or obtained new insights as a result of the webinar. Additionally, the webinar was found to be useful according to 89% of the participants. And we also shared here some quotes you see on the slides, are responses shared by some participants that caught our attention. So if I may read, open quote, I learned that I need to be more understanding with persons with disabilities, especially those who are also victims of trafficking. I will include this in my crime prevention activities. I will also educate the citizen that disability is not a barrier in promoting their right. Instead of, we should empower them. So, close quote. That was heartwarming to know. Thank you for sharing your thoughts. So after the webinar, we will again request feedback via a one-page form for which you will receive a certificate of attendance. The feedback link is now posted in the chat box. Also posted is the link to our ASEAN-ACT portal, where we will upload the Zoom recording and the PowerPoint presentations after this webinar has concluded. All right, so two basic objectives of this webinar to bear in mind. First, learn about the drivers of forced marriage, the challenges and good practices on prevention, as well as on justice responses on effective justice responses on trafficking for the purpose of forced marriage, particularly that safeguard the rights of women and young girls. And second, to promote policy and practice recommendations in improving national and transnational counter-trafficking responses. But before we move on to the core of this webinar, let us hear or get your thoughts on the topic by taking this pause. So there you go. I hope everyone can read the polls on their screen. Don't worry, you will not be asked for identification when answering the polls, and the results will be used only for this webinar. So for purposes of translation, allow me to read the polls. From your experience, what do you find most challenging in countering trafficking for the purpose of forced marriage? You can choose only one among the choices. First, increasing demand for brides. Second, many cases of trafficking for forced marriages remain unreported. Third, insufficient awareness among counter-trafficking actors. Fourth, no universal definition of forced marriage. Second poll, what measures should ASEAN member states prioritize to address cross-border trafficking for the purpose of forced marriage? Also a single choice. First, establish direct channels of communication across borders. Second, use technology to strengthen basic border control measures. Third, increase awareness about forced marriage among relevant actors and vulnerable groups. Fourth, develop our knowledge base to better understand and address trafficking for forced marriage. We will give you a few minutes to click on the answer of your preferred choice. But the polls will remain on the screen to give you more time to answer, because we know that your responses are extremely valuable and we appreciated it very much. We will present the poll results after the presentations of our speakers. All right, as we begin our session, I would like to introduce our first speaker, Mr. Sebastian Bol, who will give us a regional and international perspective on forced marriage and human trafficking. So Mr. Sebastian Bol is the Migration and Displacement Specialist at the United Nations Development Program's Bangkok Regional Hub. During his work for the UNDP in the Asia Pacific over the past 12 years, he led a research on forced marriages between Lao PDR, Cambodia, and China, and served on a global expert group advising UNODC in the development of an issue paper on the interlinkages between trafficking in persons and marriage. He is also a PhD candidate in migration studies at Maastricht University and the United Nations University. His PhD research is on broader marriage migration patterns between Cambodia and China, and seeks to understand why and how Cambodian women migrate to China for marriage through intermediaries. So, Mr. Sebastian, please, you have the floor.
Thank you, Darlene, for this very kind introduction, and thanks to ASEAN-ACT for the invitation to contribute to this webinar. Can I just check that you can hear me okay?
Can hear you very well.
Fantastic. And my slides are up as well, so we're ready to go. First of all, I do want to say that I think it's fantastic that you provide translation services on your webinars, and I'm especially impressed about the inclusion of sign language as well. I have not seen this practice much, and I would really like to commend you on this practice. I'll try and do my part to facilitate translation and speak reasonably slowly, which is not usually one of my strengths, but this is my commitment to making this a smooth webinar and presentation as well. Still though, with only 10 minutes, I want to jump straight into my presentation. I only have 4 slides, and I just want to make a few key conceptual and operational points from an international and regional perspective that I hope can frame today's discussion a bit before we hear from specialists from specific country contexts in the ASEAN region. At the outset, I do want to highlight that the interlinkages between forced marriage and human trafficking are complex and far from clear-cut. And as was mentioned during the introduction, I was part of a global expert group for a UNODC issue paper on these phenomena, and our discussions at the time with experts from various different regions illustrated the diversity of perceptions and local practices on their linkages. And while I don't agree with everything that ultimately made it into the issue paper, the document, along with other issue papers on key concepts of trafficking in persons, for example, exploitation or the concept of consent, is still very useful as a reference, and I would encourage you to consult this if the topic is of interest to you. Can I get my first slide? Thanks. The first thing to note is, and it's been mentioned by other speakers already, that international law is fairly silent on marriage, including associated crimes. There are some exceptions to this, for example, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, or the Convention on Consent to Marriage, Minimum Age for Marriage and Registration of Marriages, or the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, or the Supplementary Convention on the Abolition of Slavery, the Slave Trade, and institutions and practices similar to slavery. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights and other sources of international human rights law are very, very important in this context, as they recognize the right to marry at full age and based on free and full consent as a human right. And I'll come back to why this is important a little later in my presentation. Now, international law does not specify a minimum age for marriage, but there is increasing recognition at the international level that the minimum age should be set at 18 years for both parties. In addition, there's no international definition, and that has also been mentioned already, of forced marriage, but several UN resolutions have considered forced and child marriages as human rights violations, and child marriage is often considered a form of forced marriage itself. Can I get my second slide, please? Now, some forms of forced marriage are recognized in international law as institutions and practices similar to slavery, based on, and I've mentioned this convention already, the Supplementary Convention on the Abolition of Slavery, the Slave Trade, and institutions and practices similar to slavery of 1956. This includes, for example, a woman without the right to refuse being promised or given in marriage on payment of a consideration in money or in kind, which arguably amounts to a form of forced marriage. Since the Trafficking in Persons Protocol includes institutions and practices similar to slavery as forms of exploitation, this type of forced marriage should hence be regarded as exploitation under the Palermo Protocol. However, political and judicial actors often find it difficult to link forced marriages and trafficking in persons. And reasons for this include, for example, that marriage is seen as a private family matter in which criminal justice authorities or community support structures have little to no role to play. They also have to do with marriage being accompanied by cultural and traditional connotations and values that differ between communities and that may touch upon, issues of free will, issues of consent and arrangements of marriage through commercial actors. Can I get my third slide, please? Where links are established between marriage and trafficking in persons, however, there are broadly three approaches in law. Forced and child marriage are included as explicit examples of exploitation and trafficking in person laws, as for example is the case in Australia or in Cambodia. Another approach is for forced and child marriage to be subsumed under the concept of practices similar to slavery in TIP laws. And thirdly, forced and child marriage is understood as part of broader forms of exploitation that refer to violations of human dignity. Now, in countries where forced marriage is included as exploitation in TIP laws, it is often enough to prove that a marriage has been brought about by force for a TIP case to be established. This is based on the premise that the means component of trafficking in persons is fulfilled by virtue of force being used in bringing about a marriage, while a forced marriage in and of itself is also considered exploitative by law. And since there are few, if any, instances where an act is not present when the means and the purpose of trafficking in persons have been established, human trafficking has usually been identified. Can I get my final slide, please? Now, against this background, in preventing and responding to cases of forced marriages and trafficking in persons, it is important to remember that the right to marry at full age and based on free and full consent is recognized as a human right. This means that under international law, states have a responsibility to respect, protect, and fulfill that right to marry. However, some responses to forced marriage in Southeast Asia, which are mostly concerned with cases in China, undermine the human right to marry and amount to gender-based discrimination. For example, and without naming any particular countries, we see in some contexts that women cannot access single status certificates to marry Chinese men, have to deposit large amounts of money to be granted tourist visas to travel to China alone, and in some cases even, any marriage of women with Chinese men in China are dealt with as cases of forced marriage and human trafficking in the country of origin. Now, these are extreme policy options that are not aligned to international human rights law and seem to ignore that Southeast Asia and East Asia have a long history of arranged marriages and marriage migration, both within countries and across borders. And forced marriage may usefully be seen as a subset of these. But we only ever discuss cases of forced marriage and human trafficking, and in doing so, we forget that there are many other cross-border marriages, many of which have been facilitated by intermediaries, in which the couples concerned appear to live happy married lives. The demographic situation in China and the socioeconomic challenges for many people in Southeast Asia, particularly in the aftermath of the COVID-19 pandemic, and mounting international concerns around financial and economic conditions, these are real. And coupled with cross-cultural ties across borders and long-standing histories of cross-border and arranged marriages, marriage migration to China is unlikely to be legislated away. So rather than banning and criminalizing marriage migration and pushing this phenomenon underground, it may be more promising an approach to increase transparency, oversight, and accountability in marriage migration patterns that we see not just towards China, but also to other countries in East Asia, to Malaysia, for example, and also between other countries in the Southeast Asian region. Now, with these reflections I hope I've provided a somewhat controversial, but also hopefully a useful sort of framework from a legal perspective at the international and regional level, but also from some practical observations for the discussion to come. And I hope I didn't exceed too much my 10 minutes given, and I look forward to the discussion afterwards.
Thank you very much, Mr. Sebastian. You didn't go over time. You were just within the limits. And even with the limited time, you were able to comprehensively explain a not so familiar concept of forced marriage and how it can be linked to human trafficking using those three approaches that you've mentioned. And the recommendations you gave towards the end of your presentation is by itself whole lot of discussion that I'm sure many of our participants are eager to hear more, as I am, about this later in the open session. And I may have a question of my own. So thank you again, Mr. Sebastian. Now I take great pleasure to introduce our second equally esteemed speaker, Ms. Nguyen Thuy Hien. So she is the Vice Director of the Center for Women and Development, Vietnam Women's Union, responsible for social programs since 2015. Ms. Hien started working for the Vietnam Women's Union, or VWU, in 1996 as a staff of International Relations Department, working full-time for the Standing Office of the National Committee for the Advancement of Women, or NCFAW. She later headed the International Affairs Unit of NCFAW and Vocational Training Unit of Supporting Women in Economic Development Department. She's one of the pioneers who applied the concept of gender and gender mainstreaming in Vietnam. Her career has been dedicated to promoting gender equality and women's rights, especially for disadvantaged women and children. Currently, she manages 3 peace house shelters supporting victims of domestic violence, human trafficking, and sexual abuse. So delighted now to pass the floor to you, Ms. Hien.
Trân trọng cảm ơn ban tổ chức đã tạo cơ hội cho
Thank
tôi.
you very much, the organizing team, for making it possible for me to participate in this webinar and to share with you my working experience in my entire career. Joining in this webinar today, I would like to share with you my knowledge and experience regarding forced marriage and trafficking in person in Vietnam. So in my presentation, I will focus on 3 main points. The first one is the overall intro of forced marriage in Vietnam, including child marriage, as per the presentation of the Sebastian Ball before me. The second part is about forced marriage and trafficking interrelation. And the third part is about solutions and what the Vietnam Women's Union has been doing in our prevention and support, and especially the work done by CWD, the Center for Women Development. Ladies and gentlemen, so the revised law on marriage and families of 2014 in Vietnam introduced a definition of forced marriage, which is spiritual threatening and intimidating, the maltreatment, ill treatment, demanding property, or other acts to force a person to get married or get divorced against his or her will. Just like other countries in Vietnam, there are several forms of forced marriage currently happening in Vietnam. And well, specifically, there are 2 types of forced marriage in the northern mountain provinces of Vietnam, including what we call catching wife and child marriage. And they are actually rooted from a very long established traditions of several ethnic minorities. So catching wives is a social ritual involving a young man who can catch or arrest any woman that they desire. to enter into a marriage with that young lady, maybe a woman or even a young girl. And can I move to the next slide? And child marriage or premature marriage, it happens mainly in the ethnic minority areas in the Central Highlands. Can I have the previous slide, please? So in the Central Highlands, for example, this area accounts for 27.5%, and for the central and for the northern mountains and highlands, we have a lesser percentage. The average age is 15.8 years old for men and 17.5 years old for men and 15.8 years old for women. The main reason is the long-established cultural norms, and partly because of poverty. Families want to have more labor for their farm productivities. Next slide, please. And another form of forced marriage in Vietnam and in many other global countries is forced marriage with foreigners involving people from neighboring countries, Taiwan with Taiwanese and Chinese. So there are marriage brokerages where wives are recruited. The women and girls are pushed and coerced by their families. They can be kidnapped by their relatives. Most of the victims are women and girls. In my sharing, I have introduced some of the photos here. You can see on the slide, we have girls, Vietnamese girls who are heavily advertised on social network, including on Facebook and Zalo, our social networks, and they are advertised to Korean and Chinese men. Next slide, please. And in Vietnam, similar to other countries, while forced marriage is related to trafficking in person to some extent, in some dimension. That is why in the revised law on marriage and family of 2014, there are explicit provisions to prevent the abuse of marriage for other purpose, including for tip. And this is an exploitation or abuse of the right to marriage for the purpose of trafficking in person, labor exploitation, sexual abuse, or other illegitimate purposes for profit-seeking or self-seeking purposes. And the abuse of marriage brokerage for entering into a marriage with a foreigner, involving marriage brokers or intermediaries where the victim and their families have been deceived, and it may involve trafficking in persons, means used may involve information technologies, and many victims were forced into marriages against their will, and sometimes under the impact of their family members and relatives as well. Long-established traditions and customs may be taken advantage of for the purpose of trafficking in persons. And in addition, I can quote the example of traffickers taking advantage of the tradition of child marriage or wife catching, wife arresting for the purpose of trafficking in persons. The arrested wives are brought across border, and in case of rejection, the victims, women or girls, may be beaten or tortured. Also, I'd like to share further with you that the abuse of such traditions happened in the previous years. In recent years, gradually they have been addressed and brought under control in Vietnam. So, while forced marriage may be a purpose of trafficking in person, and well, there are other four purposes under forced marriage. So they may become the sexual, for sexual purposes for the husband or even the husband family, or they may become victim of forced labor or for forced childbearing purposes, or if they shows objection, they may be sold into certain prostitution facilities. And well, in that context, Vietnam Women's Union and the authorities of Vietnam have engaged in concrete actions for prevention. Most recently in 2021, the government issued a program called CDMA for socio-economic development for the mountainous and ethnic minority area, and we're in charge of sub-project number 8 to support implementing and promoting gender equality and addressing urgent issues for women and children, including communication, raising awareness, changing the mindset, changing the harmful traditions and norms among the ethnic minority people. And the Vietnam Women's Union is a social political organization representing the legitimate rights and interests of women. So while up to now, we have always been playing an active role in protecting the legitimate rights and interests of women. That is why, while even before the issuance of the NTP-CDMA program, we have already engaged in practical and relevant activities, including raising awareness for women and children, including those in the communities and among the relevant agencies. So from awareness being raised, that leads to the changing and shifting away from the harmful traditions and social norms. And also we challenge the existing and obsolete, outdated social traditions, and we have concrete activities to support women and children. We established centers for counseling and supporting women in marriage with foreigners immediately after the issuance of the revised law on marriage and family. So with that, we ensure that Vietnamese women, before getting married to foreigners, can be equipped with fundamental knowledge to make sure that their rights and interests could be protected before entering into a foreign marriage. And most recently, in 2020, the Vietnam Women's Union established an office to support the migrant women returnees. So we call this also offices to support the returning rights. So upon completing their marriages or divorcing, they return to Vietnam, they can receive support. And also we have established and now are operating several peace house shelters that we accommodate the returning women and children. And now I'd like to focus more on our peace house shelters, and please help to move to the next slide. Our peace house models include 3 components. The first one is our counseling offices. The second one is our hotline. The third component is our shelter, the peace house. So the purpose of the peace house is to provide free of charge support in a timely, comprehensive, and urgently to women and children who are victims of gender-based violence. We provide life skill support and sustainable and safe support. And with that, we contribute to taking necessary legal actions to protect the rights of women and children. And as I've mentioned, we support women and girls who are victims of gender-based violence, domestic violence, and the return trafficking victims. 3 months of support for sexual abuse and violently abused women and girls, and then 6 months for the other case. And then following their stay at the Peace House, we continue to provide other support to them in the following 24 months. While staying at the Peace House, the shelterees here will be provided with a comprehensive and free of charge support package. Next slide, please. So our comprehensive package support includes a 24/7 safe shelter, healthcare support, rehabilitation physically and mentally, legal aid, life skills support, entertainment services, vocational training, job opportunities, and livelihood support to the women and girls here. After 16 years of operation, now we have supported nearly 1,600 victims from 53 provinces and cities out of 63 provinces of Vietnam. And they also come from 17 ethnic groups of Vietnam. For trafficking victims, we have supported 271 of them, including 9 women from Cambodia. After leaving the Peace House, after they left the Peace House, they were organized into 2 self-reliance groups, including more than 150 members. They have become core communication collaborators for us, working at the community level to help refer other victims to the Peace House. And 90% of those shelterees said that they were satisfied with the support services. And to ensure providing sustainable and comprehensive support services to them, we have been working with other social political organizations and the authorities to provide them with all sorts of services in collaboration with the remaining entities in our network. So the Peace House is a practical example of how we can work to protect the rights and interests of women. And we have provided a lot of the case studies for the purpose of behavioral change communication. And the Peace House has become a reputable location and destination for practicing social work support. So, that is my overview, given the time limitation. So just now I've shared with you what we are doing in Vietnam, what I have been directly doing. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Ms. Xian. I'm sure 10 minutes isn't enough to, inform us all of everything that the good works that you're doing in Vietnam. It is really very interesting to learn about the modus used in forcing women and girls into marriage, including the cultural practice of catching wives and child marriages that human traffickers take advantage of. So it appears that your hands are really full in taking proactive actions in these policy reforms to address these harmful traditions, norms, and of course, changing mindsets. So we are looking forward to listening more on this later. So thank you so much, Ms. Ian. Our third presenter, a distinguished gentleman is from Myanmar, Mr. Sota Shi. He is the project manager for the Yangon Kayin Baptist Women Association, or the YKBWA. He has been working with the YKBWA as a trainer since 2006 in the child protection sector. His involvement with trafficking started with the awareness campaign, and later he worked as a field facilitator, area team leader, and assistant manager for the Child Protection Project. In 2014, he became a project manager for a trafficking project in collaboration with World Vision Myanmar, working closely with NGOs, INGOs, and government sectors, particularly the Anti-Trafficking Task Force, police units, and district lawyers. In 2017, Mr. So was interviewed by ABC regarding the work of YKBWA in rescuing Myanmar's women who had fallen victims to trafficking for forced marriage in China, and his works in assisting repatriated survivors of the bride trade at the Yangon Kayin Baptist Women's Association. May I now invite Mr. So to take the floor, please.
Okay. Alo mình là ba.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sodashi. I'm a project manager, and I've been working in this work. Basically, I'm focusing on the women and the young women and young girls and between 2014 and 2015. I've been focusing more on this issue. As for today, I would like to mention about the works that I have completed so far. Next slide, please. And from October 2015 to October 2021, within the 6 years in Yangon region, only in Yangon region, within the 6 years period time, there are 178 cases related to forced marriage only. The destination country is China on these cases. Related to legal process, we have successfully supported 107 cases on legal support. Sometimes the cases that we've seen so far is the brokers who recruited the victims, the vulnerable people through online platforms. And because of those events, related to the we have worked together with the anti-human trafficking task force, rehabilitation of groups, and in order to support the victims as well as their family members. And we also receive the news through relevant stakeholders, and as we were able to rescue and support the victims of trafficking. Next slide, please. Related to the forced marriage matters, the push factors are the factors we evaluated based on the challenges we're encountering in our country. Number one is poverty, because in some region in our country, the people are having tremendous difficulties to support themselves as well as for their family members. Another part is related to education system, because some of the victims in some regions, they do not have received proper education, and lack of job opportunities in our country is one of the main and the push factor to become the victims of the forced marriages. And when we when we provide awareness to these women and young girls, as well as the empowerment programs, we're still lack. We need to strive more on these topics. And another topic is we have to provide more awareness training on safe migration. And our Myanmar people, our Myanmar citizens, we tend to believe the strangers very easily. So this is one of the factor that has led to a big problem to this problem. Another thing is a desire, is a greed, because many of the young women, they would like to use gadgets that are like modernized gadgets, and because of that, they were very easy to lure. The brokers are easy to lure them. Another part is some young women, they would like to support their parents because they they have the traditional norms that they have to support and take care of their parents. So and with the sense, they would like to work and earn in order to support their families. Another thing is domestic violence. These are the leading causes to become the victims of the forced marriages. And sometimes parents themselves, they are causing violence in the family, and children left the houses. And another thing is parents, they do not uh, teach their children or show the way properly, so their children, they tend to uh, stray from the to become good citizens. And these are the main leading causes of the forced marriage in our country. Next slide, please. On this slide, there are two points. There are two parts. These are the cases related to forced marriage and collaboration. These events, most of the forced marriages occurred in domestically and also in a cross-border, especially with China, because this forced marriage is occurred within our country domestically and also with the border country. That due to that, we are working closely together with police task force, local police force, in order to arrest the perpetrators. And so we work together closely with them, and also the victims that were rescued, all the survivors that were rescued. We provide them we support them with the in terms of legal system. When we provide we also um, we also support them along with them when we provide when the victims attend the court as a witness. So the victims would meet the legals when they at the court. We suggest them, and we try to educate them related to the law. Another point is, and there are other INGOs. We also, some of the NGO and the INGO also work together to become witness for these victims, and also collaborate with a police force as a witnesses. These are the part when we work together with the relevant stakeholders. It's because we wish to be the witness for the victims. The first thing is related to the case management process. The first step is a family tracing. Second is family reunion. Sometimes some victims or the survivors are not welcomed by their family members. These are very sad moments, and we provide psychosocial support to these victims. So we provide counseling to these victims for the family reunification process. there were some part in the beginning of the process, we may not be able to help the victims or provide support, so that we would refer to relevant organizations that can support that need, such as health matters. So based on the information they receive, we would do the assessment on cases, and then we do the planning, what we are going to do for the next step. And also in that planning process includes the for the support, for how are we going to support the victims. And then we also evaluate these our support that we already provide to the victims, whether it is really successful or whether it is really helpful to the victim or not. So our main goal is to support the victims until they are able to stand on their feet and on to support the life. So these are the reality. Most of every cases we follow these steps in when we do the follow-up programs and the support programs. And also we are also supporting these victims through our CSO network. That will be all for my presentation for today. Thank you very much for your attention.
All right, thank you so much, Mr. So. Really intriguing to see the number of cases on forced marriages and that China is always the destination country. And thank you for sharing an extensive factors on drivers of forced marriage. And we see similar factors in the presentations mentioned by Ms. Yen and of course by Mr. Ball. And of course, I think we have one comment from the participant, Mr. No, who mentioned that these are the same factors that they see in Cambodia. So thank you so much for sharing those factors. And I couldn't agree with you more when you said that, when you highlight the importance of collaboration among relevant agencies and the protection services that you provide to the victims until they are really ready and have recovered from the experience that they had. So thank you again, Mr. So. Let us now go back to the polls and check the results. Again, for purposes of translation, allow me to read the results of the polls. Poll question 1. From your experience, what do you find most challenging in countering trafficking for the purpose of forced marriage? May I invite Ms. Yen and Mr. Ball to join us in this conversation as we discuss the poll results. Okay, for this poll number 1, we can see from the screen that 61% was given by our participants that many cases of trafficking for forced marriages remained unreported. So our participants agreed on this as being the most challenging. And second challenging would be at 23%, insufficient awareness among counter-trafficking actors. And 11% said no universal definition of forced marriage, while only 5% said increasing demand for brides. So there you go. May I also read the second question before we'll ask some reflections from our speakers. Second poll, what measures should ASEAN member states prioritize to address cross-border trafficking for the purpose of forced marriage? 50% of our participants said it is increased awareness about forced marriage among relevant actors and vulnerable groups, while 22% said develop our knowledge base to better understand and address trafficking for forced marriage. 17% for establish direct channels of communication across borders, and only 11% agreed on using technology to strengthen basic border control measures. So there you go. So based on these results, may I invite our panelists to share your thoughts and reactions on either or both polls. So may I call Mr. Sebastian, would you like to go first?
Sure. Thanks, Darlene, and thanks also to the fascinating presentations from my fellow panelists. On the webinar poll, just going through the results here for question 1. Let me roll it up from the back. So the issue of universal definition of forced marriage. I'm not that surprised that it didn't rank any higher, because I do think in the end of the day, of course, when it comes to dealing with trafficking cases or forced marriage cases across borders, it is helpful when authorities and other actors have a common language to refer to, are in a position to draw upon legislation that is broadly similar across the countries concerned. It facilitates investigations, it facilitates referrals, etc., etc. At the same time, of course, each country is in a position, irrespective of whether there is international law in place that defines any of these phenomena, is in a position to articulate legislation in line with its priorities and its understanding of a certain phenomenon, right? So in that sense, of course, in dealing with cases nationally, that is the prerogative of each and every country. And as I said in my presentation, some of the countries in the region, in the Asia Pacific region more broadly, have done so, right? For example, Cambodia has included a reference to forced marriage in its definition of exploitation, and so has Australia, in fact, with a clearly identified articulation of what that really means in practice there too. So this, of course, is very helpful. Now, as I said, it is important to have this clarified in national legislation, in that it facilitates prosecuting cases along those lines. We have seen, looking at examples around the world, where forced marriage is stipulated in the exploitation pillar, it generally greatly facilitates criminal justice proceedings, right? So in that sense, I wouldn't discount the importance. But at the same time, I don't think, and I would agree with the majority of the respondents here, that is perhaps not the biggest issue we're facing. On the point of awareness, I'm not so sure that we're still lacking awareness of the phenomenon as such. I think we've seen forced marriages now for quite a number of years, and has been a real priority in several countries in the ASEAN region. I think it is a bigger challenge to translate that awareness into functioning responses, and I think that is where really the challenge lies, and that also connects to, I think, the answer above. One of the challenges remaining, that a lot of cases remain unreported, and I mean that's not limited to forced marriages. That is, I think, a phenomenon in counter trafficking more broadly, and I think it is important to think about ways to enable those victimized to come forward, and that, for example, includes both when it comes to issues of labor exploitation in a migratory context, but also when it comes to forced marriage, to make sure that people are not concerned about coming forward because they may be in an irregular status, right? And in a lot of cases, when it comes to marriage situations, they are in actual irregular statuses in China. We know that a lot of people, a lot of women who go to China initially enter on tourist visas, who allow them generally to stay for 30 days. And beyond that, there is either overstaying or marriage becomes a means to an end. But then even many of the marriages are not formally registered or not correctly registered. So there are administrative and other challenges in place that I think make it very difficult for a lot of people to come forward because they're concerned about the repercussions of being found out about the irregular status. That's just one of many challenges that I think we need to look into in enabling people to come forward. It's also about obviously providing services where they can report their situation. We know, for example, from research in China that in a lot of cases when women come forward to local police, they return to their husbands. So these issues need resolving because ultimately that undermines victim identification. And those are just some initial reflections, and I'm happy to pass it on to my fellow panelists there.
Thank you, Mr. Sebastian. I think those were very insightful reflections. And so we would like to hear also from Ms. Ian. Your thoughts, please.
Xin cảm
So
ơn
thank you very much. Thank you, Darlene, Ms. Chair. So first of all, I do agree with the results of the webinar poll. Thank you for sharing the results with me. And I do totally agree with the points raised by Sebastian just now. So, for myself, I think that, human trafficking has become increasingly popular, and the different forms of trafficking have become even more serious. The traffickers are exploiting increasingly delicate means to recruit and lure victims, while the awareness and understanding of victims, especially those coming from disadvantaged and mountainous area, is low. So they can easily fall victims to trafficking. And actually, countries, in fact, have recognized this as a fact, and they have taken measures to address the situation. The legal framework across countries have been increasingly refined to better identify the situation. And also, as per the sharing, as per my presentation, I have shared with you, we have developed different models of support. And I totally agree with Sebastian that we need to further strengthen collaboration and cooperation across countries in the region in order to have a universal definition of forced marriage. In my presentation, I have referred to the legal provisions, but still we haven't got a universal definition across countries. So that is why it is important to strengthen cooperation across countries in order to come up with a universal definition, and also to devise common solutions, because addressing the issue of trafficking in person, this cannot be done by a single country or a single authority. We need to have the collaboration more synchronously and uniformly across entities. And in addition, another issue that we have recognized is that there are different forms of trafficking in persons, more forms of trafficking in persons compared to a couple of years ago. There are now more victims as well. However, the number of cases that have been reported and reflected in official statistics are not so plenty, because there are issues with victim identification and verification. It is a lengthy process, and that is why. And another thing is that, well, awareness and understanding of victim is very limited. Sometimes they don't even recognize that they are the victim. And that is why they don't come forward to report and to benefit from support policies and measures. So I believe that raising awareness is important, and we need to put in place the necessary measures to support them. So those are some of my prelim sharing, and I hope to hear more from you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Ian. Thank you so much. I think I couldn't agree with you more. And that was also excellently expounded on as what has already been shared by Mr. Sebastian. And now we'd like to hear from Mr. Saw.
Good afternoon once again. Related to the poll answers. Related to the trafficking, issues in our country, precisely forced marriage. Previously, we support these cases based on case by case, and also we also have cases like surrogates also. So because these surrogate cases were also one of the main concerns that were related to cross-border trafficking matters. So since we received so many cases similar to those, and moreover, the forced marriage and forced labor, these are the results from the civilian. Our people, they do not have a proper awareness training, and we do have a limited resource to provide awareness training to these people. The perpetrators are always, they are finding the opportunity to lure these victims. Whenever they have a chance, they would exploit them. When we provide the support to the survivors, what happened? The sad thing is that the survivors themselves become the perpetrators once again. So there are many instances we have found in the past. So in order to tackle these matters, we cannot work alone. We have to work together with the relevant stakeholders and our fellow partners. We still have various challenges. In some instances, some people, they do not find or they do not regard forced marriage as forced marriage, but it's like a social norms in their ethnic group. But because there are some push factors within their community. And way before in our country, internet is not widely used in our country, and these are the cases that have occurred many years back. But then when we started to use our social platforms widely in the past few years, people were informed based on the information that we received through the online. Related to these, what I would like to suggest is we look forward to work together to collaborate more together in near future. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. So. All of your inputs are very valuable. And I think the common message that we got from all of you is that there should be a stronger collaboration, not only nationally, but also across the borders. And I see one comment from our participants, and he agrees with having a stronger communication across borders. So thank you so much for all of your insightful and valuable sharing and thoughts on reflections on the results from our participants. Now let us move on to our next segment. It will feature video clips of Cambodian women being trafficked to China. This is produced by Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime, and a second video of Vietnamese child brides produced by Channel News Asia.
My husband bought me for 130,000 Chinese yen. At first, I wanted a husband and a family. I spoke to two brokers who organized and paid for me to go to China. I never saw their faces. When I arrived in China, I did not like my husband. I didn't want to marry him, but I did not know what to do. I had no other option. I didn't speak Chinese, and the broker and my husband-to-be negotiated with each other. 2 weeks later, we had a marriage certificate. My mother-in-law was so mean to me. She kept my ID document. She forced me to have sex with my husband to have a baby, but I never had a child. She didn't let me speak to another Cambodian woman in the town, and she fought and beat me. After 3 years, a Cambodian woman who lived nearby helped me escape. She stole her husband's credit card to buy me bus ticket to Shanghai. Coming home wasn't easy, but my sister and the Cambodian embassy and the anti-human trafficking organization helped me make my way back to Cambodia. Now, I work at a clothing factory in Phnom Penh.
My name is Melissa, and I produced the episode on Vietnamese girls trafficked as brides to China. China now has this problem where they have more than 30 over million more men than women. So a lot of men in rural areas actually pay matchmakers to find them brides. Some of them are legitimate, but some would actually kidnap girls and sell them off as brides to these men. One of the girls that stood out to me was this 19-year-old girl. She met this boy on Facebook and they were kind of dating. And one day after they met on a date, she was actually kidnapped.
Hôm đấy là em đi học chưa về, thằng đấy gọi cho em rủ đi chợ. Thế là đi chợ. Đến lúc mà kiểu như em nhớ thì mình đã ở địa phận bên Trung rồi. Gặp nhau hôm trước thì chắc là họ kiểu như cho thuốc mê vào hay là thế nào. Sau rồi dần dần mình.
When you read about these stories in the news, it's easy to think that these girls are just, they're uneducated, they're young, they are from a rural village. So of course they would fall for it, silly things like this. But it's hard to blame them because these boys pretending to be interested in them, they spend at least a few months to sometimes up to a year to earn that trust from these girls. And then they decide on, a specific date before they make their move.
Em lúc đấy là chỉ là mình sang bên đấy là người ta cũng dọn, nếu mà mình không đồng ý lấy chồng các kiểu thì mổ nội tạng các kiểu thì đi rồi. Họ bao nhiêu người hỏi là em đồng ý lấy họ hay là làm gì thì em chỉ biết khóc. Thế là họ cũng không
họ cũng nghĩ kiểu như là mình không đồng ý, mình khóc thì người ta cũng không lấy. Thế là em cứ kiểu như ngày nào cũng khóc.
At the time she was only 15, she told us that she was forced to do household chores and do different things, and when she doesn't listen, she got beaten.
Okay, thank you very much, Fern. So as you probably have viewed, there are so many aspects in both videos that we can talk about, even for hours, like the victims who actually sought a husband but ended up being forced into marriage, the modus that was used to get victims' trust, kidnapping victims, and so forth. So may I now again invite our distinguished speakers join us. And given our limited time, can you tell us in 2 minutes what your reflections are on the videos? May I invite Ms. Yen to share first?
So, well, with the video clip watched just now, I think it's true that, like for the case of trafficking in Cambodia, it's somewhat similar to the cases that I got to know in Vietnam. And it's true that trafficking in person happens everywhere across the globe, and especially in developing countries. And what I've seen is that, well, most of the victims are still the women and girls. The means adopted by the traffickers have become even more delicate and complex over time, and they may spend a lot of time pursuing and luring the victims, not in a short time. And given what we've heard from the expert in the video clip about trafficking in Vietnam, often there would be prejudice and preconceptions imposed upon the victims by the society. They may think that the women and girls who are the victims are somewhat easy. However, we can say that the means adopted by the traffickers are so complex. They rely on social networks and technologies to lure the victims into trafficking. Yep, so that is how I feel of the video clip just now.
Thank you, Ms. Yen. I think that's an excellent reflection. And may I call Mr. Saw, please?
Okay, the video clip label.
Okay. Thank you for the opportunity. Yes, when I see the video clip, this video reflects the reality which we have encountered so far. The cases that we have encountered when I check the video, when I see the video, some of the girls, they are not that they have a certain level of education, these women. Because in my presentation, I have mentioned that some of the girls, they wish to support their parents, and sometimes some of the girls, they want to support their parent in terms of medication. They need money for the medical expenses. So when I saw the video clip, the cases happening in the countries in our regions are very similar, have similarities. And through online like lure, in our country, we also have the trafficking matters issues, like the perpetrators would lure the girl through online platform and then sold it to the other country. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. So. Very insightful as well.
Mr. So,
call Mr. Sebastian, please.
Thank you. Yeah, I would just like to reflect a little bit on the first video and the point that the narrator made around the assistance that she received from a fellow Cambodian in the community ultimately. And that's something that has come up in a lot of our research, the importance of local communities from the same country of origin. And migration generally is a fairly patterned phenomenon. And that also includes people moving for purposes of marriages, which is to say that if you go to communities, let's say in a country of origin, that sees a lot of outmigration for marriage purposes, many of them will be clustered in particular communities in a country of destination. And so that is a real opportunity, I think, to identify support structures. Because sometimes it's difficult for them at destination to get in touch. I mean, as that person in the video mentioned, initially it was very difficult for her because the family didn't allow her to have those social contacts, but she managed to find a way in the end anyway. And in a lot of cases, from our understanding, those local networks amongst people, in this case from Cambodia, other women who have come to the same communities for marriage purposes, are very often important for just general comfort, to talk about challenges that they face in their family. In some cases, especially where they're not in a position to keep in contact with their families in Cambodia, to draw upon others in the community that can facilitate messages to their families at home. But it's also then an opportunity for people who are keen to identify those in need of support, to actually work through communities in the country of origin, right? Because oftentimes there is some level of communication with people who may be, in this case, in China, to have some reflection and understanding of their well-being, and of others who may also be in that community, and their well-being. So I think that is a real opportunity to tap into, support networks, and for stakeholders like people in this webinar to get access and information about the well-being of those who are in countries of destination. In China, we've also seen some level of local informal sort of support networks, informally organized amongst civil society, who have facilitated, in fact, seeking assistance of women who were in difficult situations in their families. But it's very difficult to tap into these and to get information about them. And so I wouldn't be able to really have any advice on how to tap into these networks. And so, based on that, I do think that these Cambodian networks, and probably networks from other countries as well, you're likely to find that from Vietnam too, and from other countries in Southeast Asia that have significant numbers of, in this case, women in China for marriage reasons, who are in a position to facilitate some level of communication with those that may need support at destination.
Thank you very much, Mr. Sebastian. That's an excellent recommendations. And I think we all agree that the videos really depicts the realities that's happening, and not only in Cambodia and Vietnam, but as Mr. So was saying, it's happening in Myanmar as well. And as emphasized by Ms. Yen, that it gets more complex, and the traffickers gets more patient, that they would invest even in that video a year just to later on use or kidnap her to become a bride. So and thank you, Mr. Sebastian, again for emphasizing the need for stronger support structures for victims of trafficking, and helping them reintegrate back into the community. So we have one more segment, and we'd like to have our speakers to stay on camera, because we are now in the last, but certainly not the least interesting. Actually, it can be the most interesting, the question and answer portion. Please limit your responses to the questions to 2 minutes. We have some few questions from our participants, and I will now give the floor to my colleague, Pom, to facilitate this session.
Thank you so much, Attorney Darlene, and it has indeed been a really fruitful discussion from the panelists that we have here, and we have a number of questions with us already that we need to we have to try our best to capture all this. So without wasting the time, I would like to first start with this question directed to Ms. Tian. And some of the questions also in concerning on how if you're able to share with us how the Vietnamese government has been working closely with the Chinese government as a Vietnam as the origin country. Are there any work on the advocacy, on the rescue, the intervention or repatriation of the victim of forced marriage from the Chinese government? Are you able to share the collaboration that the Vietnamese government have with the Chinese government, please? Thank you, Ms. Nguyen.
Vâng, rất là cảm ơn về câu hỏi.
So thank you very much for your question. So first of all, let me respond that Vietnam and China have been working very closely with each other. My understanding is that on a regular basis, while our border guard forces of Vietnam and China are engaging in regular activities, including victim return and mutual cooperation to support victims. A typical example from the Peace House, for example, while in one of our field trips by the Center for Women in Development, we got to know that there was a victim who was trafficked as a bride to China. Once informed, we immediately passed on the information to the authorities, and we work very closely with our Vietnamese border guard who contacted their Chinese colleagues, and the two parties worked together to rescue the victim. After being brought back to Vietnam, the victim was brought to our Peace House as a shelter. She returned with 2 children. She was only 19 at the time. And we provided her with the necessary knowledge and skills to take good of her children. And also we supported to prepare for the ID documents for the 2 children and provided them with access to kindergarten and provided the mother with the skills and knowledge, including vocational training and job support to the women. Now she has returned to her community. She's got a stable job. Her children sent to school in her community. So that is an example, a concrete example that I'd like to share to you from our work in the Peace House. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Yen, and I'm very glad to hear the concrete example of the cooperation between 2 countries. And if I may move to the next question, actually the same question, but then I would like to divert to Mr. Saw. So from the field of as the NGO, how do you able to cooperate with maybe the civil society in China or other agencies in China in terms of rescuing or providing assistance to the victim? Are you able to share what type of cooperation you have, either it's official or unofficial level that you have been working?
Okay,
Yes, thank you very much for the question related to the forced marriage rescue mission. The victim requested assistance to us. When we received this information, in China, they use the chatting application, which is WeChat, they use the most. So we will contact the anti-trafficking police in China. And between the 2 country collaboration, it's a collaboration among the Burmese police and the Chinese police. And then we provide the relevant information of the victims. And another thing is we provide the location of the victim to the Chinese authority. So these are the types of trafficking cases, because we regard these victims as a trafficking victims from our side and also from the other side. So these are the level of collaboration that we work together with our country and the destination country. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Saul, for giving us this example of your collaboration. So I think you have touched upon one of the point about using of the chat, and this is, I also was thinking of one of the example that Ms. Hian has shared with us about the use of social media in Vietnam that has been used as one channel of recruiting of the victim to China. Maybe I would like to throw one of these questions to Mr. Sebastian on how do you think the roles of the social media has been in maybe both promoting or worsening the situation of forced trafficking? How do you think there should be a regulation? Should the social media platform have the self-regulation, or how the government should be working with the social media platform in order to make sure that to reduce this channel of recruiting of trafficked brides?
Yeah, I mean, that's a tough and very big question that I think goes way beyond this particular topic. You know, questions around regulation of social media and you know, what is information that should be shared and is legitimate information and what isn't. I think this is very controversial as a topic and very complex. I would like to look at social media as one source of information amongst many. And I think to the extent that we can ensure that people have access to good information beyond social media, I think we have a counterbalancing effect to some extent. Of course, these communication mechanisms, you know, we heard about WeChat, for example, but also other you know, chat functions, for example, are also a very useful tool, as we've just heard, in terms of trying to, you know, get access to people over large distances and have an understanding of their well-being and whereabouts and whether they are in need of any assistance, for example. What matters to me really is and I go back to one of the points that I made during my presentation. You know, there is obviously, you know, the issue of forced marriage and trafficking in person, and all efforts are needed to obviously prevent every single case from occurring. The question to me is, I mean, how can we ensure that without undermining opportunities for others to get married and have the human rights to get married fulfilled, right? And of course, definitionally speaking and conceptually speaking, this whole area of consent lies between those different poles. One is basically the human right to get married on the basis of full and free consent, and the other one is, you know, then very quickly a case of forced marriage and trafficking in person requiring very different types of interventions. And a really important question to me is, you know, how can we bring about consent, not in terms of encouraging people to consent to a marriage, but to make sure that they have the information that they need to make an informed decision. And I think in a lot of cases, certainly based on the research that we have done in the past, you know, there's a mismatch between the information provided over the course of the migration experience, including all the way up until destination contexts, and some of the realities that people find themselves in, right? I mean, we have, as we also heard in the video, for example, on Cambodia, the person speaking there, if I remember correctly, said initially, and she was keen to go and get married, right? So the idea of going to get married was not the problem. I think it was ultimately the conditions that she found herself in that marriage context, and the choices that she was confronted with in making the decision to get married or not. And that is a really you know, vulnerable point, because oftentimes, of course, then at destination already in an environment where language is a factor, where they have often no idea of their whereabouts, where you know, they may be told that either you irregularly entered to start with, which I think is very common amongst countries that border China, in fact, or for the likes of Cambodia, for example, where in the past at least, you know, people often entered on a tourist visa, but then be told on the other side that this tourist visa is only valid for 30 days. And the only really way to regularize the status is through marriage. And so, you know, these pressure points then amount to a situation where, of course, consent is negated, right? Somebody who then says, okay, I get married, that's not full and free consent that we're talking about. And I think the question of you know, how can we make sure that throughout that process people have access to accurate information about the situation they will find at destination. Of course, there will always be some limits, right? You don't know what the family on the other side of the border is going to be like if you have never actually engaged with that family prior. So that, you know, for example, is already an entry point. How can we facilitate contacts between people who may be considering, you know, to get married in China or anywhere else prior the migratory process actually sets in, to ensure that, you know, they get comfortable with each other or not, or decide to go different ways, for example. But to arrive at destination and then be confronted with situations that you're not happy with, and be confronted also with the pressures of returning. In many cases, the brokers would then say, well, then you have to repay, you know, thousands of dollars if we send you back, because we've invested in your journey to China. You know, these are extremely challenging situations, and we cannot speak about free consent in that situation. So to me, this is a very, very fascinating question, and one that, you know, I don't have per se an answer on, but I think that we would need to focus on as well in trying to find answers.
Thank you so much, Sebastian. That's indeed like a big question, $1 million question for us all, indeed. If I may, maybe the next question I would like to reach out to Ms. Hien, and this one is regarding when the victim has been repatriated and probably has been rescued and saved into the shelter or in the house. There's a question that's wondering if, are there any, are we reaching out to work with the victim or survivor to seek information in order to get them or give us evidence, or to give information in terms of the Chinese husband, the brokerage, in order to tap into the criminal group, to suppress them or to persecute them, to make sure that these people are criminalized. How the shelter work with the victim to make sure that this information will be transferred to the law enforcer to get this perpetrator prosecuted.
Yes, so in response to your question, well, in my presentation, I didn't have enough time to elaborate further regarding the work that we do at the Peace House in this regard. So, well, when we receive victims, once they have been placed into the Peace House, we also work well in a multidisciplinary manner with the authorities. In response to your question, well, thanks to that multidisciplinary cooperation, in cases where the victims have been rescued, after we have supported the victims to make them feel psychologically assured and stable, and while procuring other support to them, including nutritional and healthcare support, we also work very closely with the authorities, including the border guards or the police, in the process of victim identification and verification. And also we call the victim client, while we support them in working with the criminal justice bodies to obtain information to track down the perpetrators. In my presentation, I already mentioned that we provide legal aid concerning victim identification and providing ID document support to them. And including maybe both certificates for the clients, children as well, upon returning to Vietnam. So this is evidence that we work very closely with other relevant authorities to protect the legitimate rights and interests of the victims.
Thank you so much, Ms. Hien. And maybe the last one, I would like to also ask the same question to Mr. Saw. How do you, as the civil society or NGO, work with the survivor to make sure that the perpetrator would also be persecuted? How do you work with the victim or survivor in obtain information and work with the authority to make sure that the victim will be supported, as well as will bring about the justice to them, to get those who perpetrated their rights to the justice?
Okay,
Thank you very much for the question, and respond to your question. The returnees or the victims, the survivors, when we regard them as a victim, we work closely or work together with the anti-trafficking task force, and based on the screening process. And the returnees, because these victims have most of them have fears in their heart. So when we talk about the legislation process or legal process, or the rights to get their rights, we have to inform them that the rights they are entitled to. When we study the cases, the perpetrators, some of the perpetrators are the person that they know. Sometimes it can be like from the same community or the relatives. So it's very rare that the victims, most of the victims, they are being threatened. Right. If you enclose our information to the authorities, I will kill all your family members. These are the types of threatening level the victims are getting. So that's why we have to work closely together with the anti-trafficking task force. And about the legal process, we would stay together with the stand together with the victim in order to provide the psychosocial support at the court. So when we were together with them, so they could be the good witness at the court. And also another part is our NGO. We also provide the we also provide some sort of like the work so that they can stand by themselves. And another thing is the main challenge is that we have to be with them and let them understand that we are together with them from the beginning to the end, in terms of, because the victims, they have in their heart that they have a worry that whether if I testify against the perpetrator, whether this case will be actually prosecuted or not. These are the big questions they have in mind. So that's why we have to encourage them all the way in the process. So these are the types of process that we have done so far, and we have succeeded also. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Saw. And unfortunately, time is of the essence, and we're unable to answer to all the questions that have been fluxing into our chat box, but we do apologize for that. And in this regard, I would like to hand the floor back to Attorney Darlene, and thank you so much for having me here.
Thank you so much, Bong, for excellently facilitating this session. And it was really a pleasure to hear from everyone who participated online with questions that has certainly made the conversation with our panelists more robust. And yes, there are more questions there, and I hope our panelists would be kind enough. You may answer directly those questions in the chat box if you would like to, but otherwise we can always respond to this later on and send the response via email. So again, I would like to invite our panelists to share any final thoughts. It could even be one that has been really burning in the chat box about consent and all that. So, but really up to you, any final thoughts, recommendations that you would like to leave our for our audience to think about after they leave the webinar, please do so. So may I call Mr. So to give his final thoughts first.
첫 번째가 미국 미번호.
ဟုတ်တယ် chat box ကိုပြီးတော့ဒါနဲ့
ဒီ post marriage ကတရုတ်ကိုပဲလားတရုတ်ကိုပဲပေါ့နော်အဲ့ဒါတွေကို short ချနိုင်ဖို့ဆိုတဲ့အရာတွေမှာ
I would like to highlight on the cases on forced marriage about with China. We would like to reduce the cases. So if we have a proper or the increased collaboration with the Chinese authority, that would be the one of the means that we could reduce this type of hideous crime in our region. Because when we ask the victims or the returnees, because sometimes some of the cases, the returnees, when we work together with the other relevant authorities, they do not regard these as trafficking cases. So, but the forced marriage is actually directly related to the trafficking. If the cases are regarded as trafficking, these forced marriages, I believe that this type of crime will reduce. And in a sense, this will also reduce the forced marriage cases in our region. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. So. And may I call on Miss Yen, please?
Và về phía tôi thì tôi cũng chỉ muốn
for myself, I would like to add just a little point. I think very highly of the initiative that we maintain these webinars, and we have attracted a higher number of participants over time. This means that people are paying more and more attention to this issue. And what I have not covered in my presentation, and I wish I had covered, is that, well, maybe we could involve more participants from the relevant countries to enrich our discussion. And while in our region, I really hope that we have opportunities for us to visit other countries to find out more about the effective models that are being implemented from your countries. And we hope to have more fact sheets and brochures giving us an update of the successful models in other countries. And we can distribute those fact sheets and the brochures to the peer countries so we can get more information and take steps to prevent these crime. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ms. Yen, for those last thoughts. And now, Mr. Sebastian, please.
Thanks. If okay with you, I will use my time to answer a few more questions in the chat, some of which are directly to me. There's this one, for example, on how do I view a marriage of a young girl initiated by her parents based on tradition or religion, and I think that's an extremely good and very, very complex question. Of course, you know, based on the reflection on international law that I shared at the start, you know, this would be considered a significant developmental issue. It is an issue that in some cases, will be classified as cases of forced marriage. But the question is, how do we respond to that? And to me, the response to this is not a criminal justice response. I think this is a developmental challenge. And so sometimes we have to be also pragmatic in how we deal with certain phenomenon, even though they may under international law or whatever classify as a crime requiring certain types of interventions, and perhaps even based on national legislation. But these types of challenges, are long-term developmental challenges, and I don't think these underage girls are served by their parents serving years in prison because they've been sentenced on the basis of a crime. But I mean, obviously this is a very complex challenge, and this is a very simplified answer now. I understand we're running out of time. I would happily continue discussing some of the other questions, but perhaps I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much, Mr. Sebastian Bol, and thank you for using your time in answering one more question. And I'm sure Prosecutor Lau would be very happy to hear your answer. And so we will take note of our speaker's last notes. And I think, again, there is an emphasis on cross-border cooperation and including strengthening victim identification. And of course, the more conversation or communication among relevant partners. And so in conclusion, but first I would like to thank Mr. Hien, Mr. So, and Mr. Sebastian. All of your advices are extremely relevant and something to ponder for our participants, and myself included. So in conclusion, I would like to invite our team leader, Dr. Lucia Pietropaoli, to share a brief summary and her closing remarks. Dr. Lucia, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Darlene, and thank you to all our expert panelists. It really is an honour to close this webinar today on a topic that is directly and often adversely affecting women and girls in the Southeast Asian region. And I think it's timely as we come to the end of this month, in which we commemorate International Women's Day, which this year had a particular focus on digital equality and the rights of women and girls to safely and fairly access technology to further their empowerment and advancement. It's highly relevant to reflect on this form of trafficking, which increasingly involves the use and misuse of technology. As we saw from the presentations today, technology often plays a role in facilitating trafficking for forced marriages, with social media platforms being used to recruit, advertise, transport and harbour women and girls, particularly from Southeast Asian countries to China. But really insightfully, we also heard today that forced and underage marriage can also be grounded in long-standing traditions and cultural practices in certain communities in Southeast Asia, which allow for women to be captured, controlled, and effectively traded into marriages. So the complex phenomenon that we see before us today is actually a combination of traditional patriarchal norms that oppress women and girls, combined with modern modus operandi and contemporary social and economic pressures, which can easily be exploited by traffickers. In this context, we unfortunately have a perfect storm leading to the oppression and exploitation of women and girls. All of our panelists today helped us to understand and unpack the complexity of trafficking for forced marriage. You also highlighted the need for very localized and contextualized research and interventions, which take into account the cultural, social, and economic dimensions that underpin trafficking for forced marriage. Mr. Sebastian Bol, thank you very much for providing a really clear scene setter on the law that exists in relation to the right to freely and fully choose to marry or not to marry, as well as the gaps surrounding the lack of international definition of forced marriage. But you also highlighted that having an international definition of forced marriage may take us part of the way, but definitely won't be a panacea for addressing this problem. You also pointed out the emerging global consensus around the minimum marriage age, which should be set at 18 for both men and women, based on the principle that children cannot freely consent to marriage. And so from this perspective, all child marriages or underage marriages really can be considered forced marriages. You also raised the really good point of marriage often being considered a private or family matter that occurs in the private sphere well beyond the reach of the state. But encouragingly, I think we are seeing there's increasing recognition that states do have a role in protecting the human rights of women and girls, including to choose if, when, and who they marry. And you made the really good point that Southeast Asia and East Asia do have long histories of arranged marriage and migration for the purpose of marriage. So it's very clear that marriage migration to China and to other countries is likely to continue in the same way that in this region, people will always migrate for work. So in many ways, we need to acknowledge the reality of migration for marriage and look at ways to minimize the harm to women and girls, both during those migration journeys and within those marriage situations. This may or be a criminal justice response. Ms. Hen, it was really pleasing to hear that Vietnam has a legal definition of forced marriage and that there is growing awareness around forced marriage as a crime in Vietnam. However, despite this strong progress, you also shared the deeply rooted drivers of forced marriage in certain ethnic communities in Vietnam, including the practice of capturing or kidnapping women for the purpose of marriage. So this shows that we need a very targeted response to preventing and responding to this phenomenon that really is targeted to local language and awareness of the gender and community dynamics in certain ethnic communities. It was also really interesting to hear the difference in ages that men and boys and women and girls are marrying in Vietnam, with girls as early as 15 marrying for a range of reasons, including to escape poverty, lack of opportunity, and violence and abuse. So these factors, combined with the growing use of technology in Vietnam and the role of social media, really shows how quickly and how easily women and girls can actually be trafficked into situations of forced marriage. It was really encouraging to hear about some of the good practices of the Peace House and the Vietnam Women's Union, including access to counsellors and legal aid for victim survivors to address grievances and support to exit from forced marriage when and where it's possible. And to Mr. Saw, thank you very much for highlighting and concurring that the internet and lack of awareness among women and girls in Myanmar of the risks of using the internet can easily lead to deception online and sometimes to exploitation. Even though the spread of the internet in Myanmar is still uneven, we know that connectivity is growing and that many people are using social media to look for work opportunities and to get out of situations of poverty, lack of job opportunities, family pressures, and lack of safe migration channels. These are all key drivers of forced marriage in Myanmar. And you also made the very good point that social norms, in particular ethnic groups, do not always consider forced marriages to be harmful to women and girls. Your presentation really highlighted to us that laws, policies and programs that increase gender equality are really a key counter-trafficking response. And this is very timely because we often talk about gender-sensitive responses to trafficking, but you reminded us that the actual drivers of trafficking are very much linked to inequalities between men and women, boys and girls, when it comes to education, livelihoods, job opportunities, and cultural beliefs about the roles of about the role of gender in our societies. In terms of good practices, it was great to hear that NGOs are working closely with victim survivors as well as law enforcement to share information and support victims in the case of a criminal justice process. And also great to hear that CSOs are working as part of a network, not just as individual organisations, to support the prevention and responses to forced marriage. So in closing, I would like to highlight some really good examples we heard of what works in responding to this very complex problem. We do need locally led, community-based responses, and we heard that these can be very effective in preventing women and girls from being trafficked for the purpose of marriage, but also supporting women and girls in destination countries who do migrate to marry to ensure that they're safe, that their well-being is accounted for, and that perhaps if they are wanting and are identified as a victim of trafficking, that they're supported to do so. We also heard that repatriation and return processes need to be coordinated and supported, including helping victims and survivors access legal identity, livelihoods, and support for their families. And it was very encouraging to hear that there have been bilateral cooperation in the case of trafficking for forced marriage. So it's clear from this discussion today, ladies and gentlemen, that forced marriage is a really complex issue. Trafficking for forced marriage is an even more complex issue, and it links into broader questions about consent, the abuse of a position of vulnerability, and the inherent power imbalances that exist in a patriarchal society. We're not going to be able to answer all those questions in 2 hours, but we do hope that we've sparked your interest in this really pressing issue, and that you may have created some new connections which may be pursued to further discuss prevention and improved responses to countering trafficking for forced marriage. Thank you again, everyone, for your interest and your strong engagement today. We're looking forward to seeing you at our next webinar, which will focus on the urgent topic of trafficking and exploitation in online scamming centres in the Mekong, which I know will be of interest to you all. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Lucia, ASEAN-ACT team leader. As always, you excellently captured the highlights of today's discussion and for closing the webinar on a high note. So on behalf of ASEAN-ACT, please accept our warmest appreciation. It has been an honor and pleasure to have you, Mr. Sebastian Ball, Migration and Displacement Specialist, UNDP Asia Pacific, Ms. Nguyen Thuy Hien, Vice Director of the Center for Women and Development, Vietnam Women's Union, and Mr. So Tashi, Project Manager for the Yangon Kayin Baptist Women Association. Being with you today and with all our participants is a wonderful way to end the week. So we hope this webinar has been beneficial to you in terms of insights and knowledge on the forced labor dimension of human trafficking. For our online audience, we would like or love to hear your thoughts again. So please take a few minutes to fill out the one-page feedback survey. The link is shared in the chat box. Upon completing the survey, your certificate of attendance will be sent to the email address you have entered in the survey. So you will be able to access the Zoom recording as well as all the presentations of our speakers via our ASEAN-ACT portal. And we will be hosting more exciting webinars this 2023, with the next one taking place on the 30th of May about workers forced to scam online. Are they traffic victims or not? So continue to be safe and well. Goodbye, everyone. Enjoy your weekend.